Hi, I'm Reed Peterson, and welcome to Grief Refuge. Here at Grief Refuge, you have a safe and sacred space to hold your grief, to honor it, to feel it, and to heal it. This podcast, it isn't your typical talk about grief podcast. This podcast is more of a what to do with grief podcast. Grief Refuge is about being in your heart and honoring your truth. I'm very grateful you're here with me today. I look forward to helping in whatever way I can, hoping that you feel more comforted, supported, and perhaps even educated about your own personal grief experience. If it's possible at this time, please stop any multitasking you're doing. The best thing for you to do right now is to find a comfortable position. Relax. Maybe close your eyes, take a few deep breaths, and keep an open heart for what's shared next. So, I have a question for you. Does mindfulness keep showing up on your radar? What I mean by that is, have you seen or heard all this mindfulness stuff more recently? These claims that it will help cope with anxiety, fear, and even depression? Currently, I'm feeling like mindfulness is pretty much showing up everywhere. And it's showing up as like a resolution or a solution to many of these problems that we as humans experience. Mindfulness is even showing up as a way to cope with grief. I have to admit that the first time that this was brought to my attention, I was a bit skeptical. And honestly, a bit naive. I was thinking that mindfulness was a form of meditation, and it was a specific form that focuses on detachment. And I didn't like that idea of detaching from grief-related feelings. I mean, sure, we all need our breaks from grief, but to fully detach, I just didn't see that as something that was in alignment with healing. I subscribe to the belief that in order to heal, you have to feel. And realizing that my perception of mindfulness was a bit limited, I ended up reaching out to a colleague in the grief support space, Heather Stang. Heather is the director of the Mindfulness and Grief Institute. She's also the author of Mindfulness and Grief and her new book titled Grief to Peace. I interviewed Heather to learn more about the role mindfulness has with grief, feeling better, and healing. It was a true joy to have this conversation with Heather. I really like what she had to say. So will mindfulness help with your grief? I hope you get the answer from listening to our conversation.
Heather, I just so appreciate your time today. I so appreciate your willingness to share more about your story. I want to start by telling you that I'm a big fan of your Mindfulness and Grief podcast. I listen to every episode probably within a couple days after they're published. And what really stands out for me is how easygoing you are and how relatable you are. I think you're a tremendous listener. And there's so many times where I hear your guests speak to about their own experiences on their grief journey. I know that some people don't like the word grief journey, but it's something that I gravitate towards because I tend to believe that grief stays with you. So it is not a destination and it is a journey. But there's been many times when I've listened to your episodes and you share snippets of some of your own experiences. And I just had this revelation more recently where I was like, gosh, Heather has such a unique perspective on grief and mindfulness and how the two can support each other, for lack of a better word. And I was like, I bet there's so much more to her story. And so that's why I asked you to be a guest today. And what I'm hoping to learn from you is a little bit more about how mindfulness found you in your grief.
Mm. Yeah, well, the grief came first, and the chicken and the egg of it all. Um, like I didn't know I needed mindfulness for a long, long, long time. And I want to say I appreciate that you have that curiosity around my story, because I have a curiosity around everybody's grief story, because I think that's what forms us and, makes us who we are. And being able to tell your story is really important. And for me, being able to tell my story is important too, because my story is about people I love, and will always love. You're also recording this just at such an interesting time, on my grief journey. And I'm comfortable with that word. I know some people, I agree with you, some people don't like it, but I'm definitely on a grief journey. So, if it's okay, I'll start with my very first loss
Please do.
out outside of the fish, which, by the way, it turns out was about 50 fish that my mother flushed down the toilet before she finally told me what death was,
Mm.
which is the story of a lot of kids.
Wow.
But then maybe you haven't heard that one, but my mother finally could not keep buying fish.
Mm.
Um, but then she unfortunately had to tell me about a human loss when I was 7. And my mother would have been, gosh, it happened around our birthdays. So she was either 26 or 27 at the time. And she has me and her brother, my uncle Doug, had died by suicide in Alaska. We lived in Maryland. And the day after she found out, they pulled me out of school and told me, and we all got in the car and drove to North Carolina. And that's like where my grief story begins, is the little girl um, first walking down the hallway of school thinking I might be in trouble for something because they're pulling me out of class, but then having my mother kneel in front of me with, as I remember it, the car door open and tell me that, Uncle Doug has died. And even though that was 1977 and we're in 2021, and I know I don't remember everything of that moment, that is one of the most important moments in my life.
Mm. Can you share a little bit more about how that defined importance for you?
Yeah, and right now I'm feeling a real strong wave of emotion, because I just want to share that a couple weeks, actually not even a couple weeks ago, about a week ago, I opened a box that my mom had just given me, and I found all of my Uncle Doug's driver's licenses that she had put in a box to give me, but hadn't told me they were in there.
Mm-hmm.
And even though I've shared this with people because, number one, it makes me feel better to talk about my story, but also so in that moment, the wave of grief was so big. And so, how does the death of my Uncle Doug, impact my life? Well, number one, I was a kid who went through life knowing what suicide was. And that casts a veil that both makes life really precious, but also very fragile. And it also put me in the unfortunate position that a lot of people who lose a loved one to suicide are in, where you can't always talk about it. You can't get all the answers, even though you want them. Even within your own family, there's often this shield of silence, which we certainly experienced. But how it impacts what I do now, it was Doug's death that inspired me to get involved in suicide prevention, when I was older. And that was actually a byproduct of mindfulness. So this is where mindfulness comes in.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't want to say I led a meaningless life before that, because I think my life had some meaning, but it definitely was like, you know, I don't know. I started a web development company. I lived my life, but I wasn't living my life with intention, and I was stressed out and I was drinking and I wasn't really, I think, totally here. And my body rebelled and I got shingles. And anyone who's had that knows it does not feel good. Not only the pain, but there's kind of this low grade nervous feeling. And a nurse practitioner told me to get a grip and go find yoga. She said, you need to get a grip on your stress. Go try yoga.
Was that
And
completely from left field at that time?
so from left field. Now, I had dabbled in yoga before, as a child of the 70s. My mom and I had watched, I think it's Lila on TV on PBS, and done it when we were little. And, I'd done it at a gym, but it was out of left field for what I was doing then. I'd been a ballet dancer, but that's honestly, to me, it was kind of the opposite of yoga, because ballet is about how you look, yoga is about how you feel.
Mm.
And so definitely trying yoga was pretty, well, when you experience things like grief and stress and loss and pain, going into the body is a journey in and of itself. Um, because that's where all the emotions live, that's where all the feels live. And so I got a book on yoga and spent a week teaching myself yoga through the book. And very quickly, I felt a lot of emotion, but I also started to feel a little better, because the two don't have to be separate. And I think that's what I love about mindfulness and grief. Even when the worst is happening, if you have a way to calm your anxiety, to feel like you have even a little bit of control over your attention and emotions, that can feel good. I hope that makes sense, because it's hard. I'm realizing how hard it is to explain that.
It is hard to explain it. Yeah, I think you're doing a fantastic articulation of it. I think I want to ask a question about mindfulness, if it's okay, because a lot of people I talk to that are grieving, they make an association that mindfulness, in order to experience mindfulness, you have to meditate. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I like to say that mindfulness is both a form of meditation, but it's also a state of mind. And so it's something you can go and sit on a meditation cushion or in a chair and practice. But also in this moment, you can be mindful by listening to the sounds that are coming through your earbuds as you listen to this podcast, by feeling your feet on the floor, by noticing your breath, by just being present to what's happening, and noticing when you lose track of the moment, when you go off into, memories of your own grief experience, or maybe my mind wanders into, oh, I hope I'm saying the right thing. Like, bring myself back to just what's happening right now. And so you can be mindful in everyday life. It's really hard to be mindful in every moment. And I think a lot of people think that if they're not always mindful, that might as well just give up. But I can tell you from personal experience and working with students and clients since, I started teaching back in, I think, 2002, that even just a few minutes of mindfulness here and there can really change your life.
It definitely can. And so, been thinking about the body since you were talking a little bit about it too, and where the feels and the emotions are held. That can be a very scary place, especially for people that are, I'll just use the word burdened by their own grief, or really sinking in the depths of what maybe experienced a sadness or sorrow. And I'm curious if there's any, I guess, insight. Is there any insight that you could share in regards to people who are that scared about feeling more into their own bodies?
Oh yeah, I can share a lot of insight. So first I want to start with insight that comes from my training as a Phoenix Rising yoga therapist, which is a specific style of yoga therapy. And our founder, Michael Lee, teaches about the edge, which is a concept you'll find in um, many different therapeutic techniques, but I think he really harnesses it well and explains it well. And he talks about the edge in the body or in an emotion, let's just say in an experience, as a place where what you're experiencing is interesting and is going to perhaps move you forward or help you find insight, but isn't too much. And so if we think of literally walking up to, say, the edge of a cliff, if you go too far over, you're going to get hurt. If you stay back 10 miles, you're never going to see the view. And so it's finding that right place with whatever your experience is, whether it's emotional pain or physical pain, where you can be present to it without either being overwhelmed or checked out. So that's one way of looking at it. And then another thing that I teach people when I'm working with them who are really early in grief or in intense pain, myself, when, I've had major losses or challenges in life, is that there is wisdom in taking a break from the pain in a skillful way. So again, not checking out where you're, you know, doing something harmful to yourself to numb the pain, so to speak, but where you're doing something like, instead of focusing on the pain in your heart or in your body, you just count the number of breaths you have, or you repeat a mantra over and over, or you gaze at a flower, or you look outside and just watch each car as it passes, where you're giving your mind something to do that's somewhat neutral or maybe even pleasurable, but that's focusing your attention away from the depths of the pain, because we need a break. And I think when you're early in grief, and a lot of people experience this, I have experienced this question comes up when I do trainings with professionals. It's like, what do you do when someone feels guilty when they're not focusing on their grief?
Mm.
And you've probably experienced that or experienced it with people you've worked with. I have, where it's like, if I stop feeling bad, I'm going to somehow be forgetting, or I don't want to focus on going back to work or doing this because I'm not thinking about him or her, and I'm going to forget them.
Right.
And this shows up a lot. And one thing I can say is you will never forget them. You're going to be able to probably remember and connect with the love and the memories more deeply if you're not feeling overwhelmed and beaten down and exhausted.
Mm-hmm.
And that it's normal for humans to move back and forth between coping with our grief and re-engaging in our life. And re-engaging in your life doesn't mean you have to let go of them. You won't. You carry them with you. So I know it kind of moved from the body and the mind into more grief theory, but I think that idea of turning towards your grief and turning away from your grief with mindful awareness is true both in meditation practice and in grief work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. As a visual learner, I also appreciate your examples, at the edge of the cliff and some of the other examples you provided, because it can help take a complex topic and put it into perspective and help simplify the understanding. So I feel like I'm bouncing back as far as asking you questions, because something came up for me, and I was curious more about tying back into your personal experience with grieving and mindfulness. I was very curious, Heather, if there was an aha moment where, for you, feeling your grief and then recognizing mindfulness as, if it's okay to call it a practice, mindfulness, where you said, oh, okay, I can dance with both of these, metaphorically.
Yeah, right. Well, and maybe with me quite literally. It's hard to say.
Mhm.
Wow, was there an aha moment where I realized I could dance with him? This is a really good question, and it's stretching my brain, because I think it was more of a, to borrow the title of a book, and I can't remember who it was. It's a great meditation book, and forgive me, the author, but A Gradual Awakening is the name of the book, and it's about meditation. And I think that was probably more of my experience in terms of my own grief journey. I did have an aha moment, I'll say professionally or scholastically, where I was sitting in class. I was in grad school for thanatology, which is the study of death, dying, and bereavement. And we were talking about grief and its impact on the body, which it's this huge stress response, not to mention a lot of people experience somatic symptoms that might be similar to the person who died, the feeling of hollowness in your chest. I mean, not everybody experiences the same things, but there's some similar responses. And, I just had this moment where I wrote in my notebook, yoga for grief with the question mark. And it just hit me like, that's what I want to do. But I think if I look back on my personal journey, probably that moment where I decide to sign up as a listener on the hotline would be a place we could explore, where I was like, I can live with the impact of Doug's death in my life in a meaningful way, where I can hold both the sorrow and the hope. But I think as far as applying mindfulness to my own grief, it's so subtle. And maybe that's why I do what I do, is because I wish somebody had been like, here is this thing you can use. Here's this thing you can do, and it won't fix the story and it won't bring your person back. And I've had other deaths, by the way, which we can go into or not. But, now I want to, knowing I can't fix the story, I can't change things, I can't make it all better, but I can give you something to at least alleviate some of the physical symptoms, and at least help you feel like you can get some of your power back inside your brain, which for most of us, when we have a major loss, feels like it's completely out of control. We may not even recognize ourselves. And this brings you closer back to yourself, or closer to who you're becoming, because grief does change you.
Heather, this is going to sound completely random, but are you gentle with yourself?
Oh, yes and no. I'm a Libra. So being gentle with myself is a huge practice. It's a huge practice.
Okay. The reason why I ask is, for the people that reach out to me, one of the first things that I recognize when I get the opportunity to listen to their current experience and their experience in their grief is that there's a lot of self-punishment. And yes, that sounds like a judgment, but I don't necessarily mean it that way. It sounds to me as a listener like, wow, this person's sharing with me, they have a lot of self-expectations. This person sharing with me is really hard on themselves for not doing blank or doing blank. And this person I'm listening to, like, they're judging themselves. So that's where I see a lot of self-punishment. And I am so intrigued to learn more about if you've seen in your own experience and or in your Mindfulness and Grief Institute and the participants who are part of that, is there development there, for lack of a better word? Is there people, are you seeing people learn to be more gentle with themselves in their own grief process?
I think that is my number one goal,
Mm.
is to teach people self-compassion for grief. In fact, one of my favorite keynote topics is called self-compassion as self-care. And sometimes that's for professional caregivers and sometimes it's for bereaved people. And that is based on the work of researcher Kristen Neff, who wrote a wonderful book called Self-Compassion. And she breaks down the idea of self-compassion. For those of you who are listening and myself, the word self-compassion, if you come from a self-critical background, is just like, whoa. Like, I know that's, you know what, that's for other people. That's not for me. But it is for you and it's for me. And so when you brought up, like, in my heart on myself, and I'm like, yes and no, it's a practice. About 4 years ago, I had a loss, a non-death loss in my life where I became estranged from a family member. And it was a choice. It was a hard choice with the help of my therapist, who I've had since I was 16 and I'm now 50. So knows my story. Um, and I realized all the problems weren't my fault. Like, that was a huge moment. And I'm still working on that. But it caused me to seek out a mindful solution to that inner voice that is, you're never good enough. You're always doing it wrong, which, if I want to help people, that voice is hindering me. And if I want to feel good in my day-to-day life, that voice is oppressing me. So that's my backstory on my passion for self-compassion. But Kristen Neff breaks it down into 3 components. Self-compassion is mindfulness, common humanity, and kindness, self-kindness. And so one of the first practices I do when I'm working with someone or a group in grief, a lot of times, is where we visualize a friend or a family member or an imaginary person who comes to you and they're going through exactly what you're going through, like your story. And in this visualization, you're the one offering them comfort. And you imagine, what would you say? How would you feel? What would you do? And we hang out with that for a few moments, and then you turn it back on yourself. What would it be like to receive the words that you offered that person? And it's powerful. I found it especially powerful when I'm working with family members who've lost a loved one to suicide or overdose loss, which are very disenfranchised types of losses. And there can be a lot of feelings of, I didn't do enough, even though if you're sitting in a room full of mothers who are grieving a child who's died by overdose, you see they have done everything they possibly could and then some. They've gone to Herculean efforts, but the story didn't turn out the way we wish it had. And none of them would criticize each other. No mother would look across the room and be like, you didn't do enough. But it's so easy, to do that to ourselves. So I think judging one's experience of grief, like, why can't I get it together? Why can't I just be able to go to the grocery store and not have a nervous breakdown? All those, there's hundreds of those, right? It's really normal. Like, it's a really normal experience to judge your grief experience, but it's also really freeing to be able to let that go. But it takes work sometimes.
Yeah.
And that visualization is something I hope you all will try. Um, and then don't expect it to be perfect. Don't expect to be able to offer yourself those words and be able to receive them right off the bat, but keep trying. And it whittles away your guard little by little
Mm.
to where your heart opens up to yourself.
Well, thank you. We really appreciate that as a visualization and a tip to practice. One of the things I'm recognizing as I listen to you is that one of the gifts I see that you bring is you help simplify. You help simplify something as complex as grief, and you can put it into, I don't want to call it steps, but you can put it into aspects that are easily relatable. And especially as a visual learner, it's like, oh, I can see, this experience of it. Now I can see this experience, and now I can see this experience. And so I want to compliment you on that. That's quite a gift you have. Thank you.
Well, now that I know you're a visual learner, I'm just going to keep the images coming.
Sounds good. Uh, there's one more thing that's really been on my mind, and I'm really curious. When I work with people deep in their grief, one of the factors that I recognize that contributes to a lot of their pain is similar to what we're talking about, but also very different. The need for control, and this aspect of, like, sometimes everything falls apart in your grief, and there's little or no control. And yet, tying into the judging thyself and wanting, to have a grip, wanting to be more normal, quote unquote normal, wanting to be able to relate to others, and also hating that it's not happening. I recognize a lot of people strive to control the pain, the grief related pain. And I was very curious if there's a mindfulness visualization, or if there's stories mindfulness related that help speak to, for lack of a better word, comforting or soothing some of that need for control of grief.
Mm. Yeah, you're right. Everything does fall apart for maybe not everything for all people, but a lot of important things fall apart. And grief isn't something you control. In fact, when we look at the definition of grief as thanatologists use it, we specifically say the uncontrollable experience of loss. Like, which right away takes away any blame and shame for feeling how you're feeling. Like, it's just a natural response to loss. You're not choosing to feel awful. It's normal. That doesn't, again, alleviate the pain, but it does maybe take away some of that burden we put on ourselves.
Yeah, it can
So,
help reduce expectation.
yeah. Yeah, it's funny because I was talking to someone recently who said, their person had died, I think, a week before, and they were talking to me on their last day of bereavement leave. And they're like, well, other people have had losses in the office and they just come back and they're fine. And I'm like, no, they're not. They're just looking fine. I bet if you go find the people that you before thought came back after a loss and looked fine and ask them, they're going to be like, oh my gosh, it took everything I had to make it through the day. So I think we're very universal um, in being, yeah, in trying to find ways to control our pain. So here's a couple ideas. One is control what you can. So that includes things like little things like drinking water like trying to get a little bit of nutritious food in your body. It's okay to have the macaroni and cheese that someone brought over, but try to get a little broccoli in or something. Try to spend 30 seconds just looking outside and not thinking, just observing something, just mindfully being present. Little moments where you're choosing what to do, even if it doesn't seem like this big operatic accomplishment, little by little, that's going to help. A lot of my clients, what they control is showing up to grief group every week, maybe trying to practice meditation a couple times a week, and then recognizing that waves of emotion are going to come and go. And so I think of the serenity prayer, right? Which is, what is it? The wisdom to control. I get it wrong, but it's about learning to control what you can and learning to let go of what you can't. So that's part of it. I think another mindfulness technique that might be really helpful, and you're going to like this because it involves visual, is the practice that is very popular in mindfulness circles called RAIN, RAIN. It's an acronym. And so instead of trying to control an emotion when it arises, you learn how to turn towards the emotion in a way that's a little bit different. So normally when we feel, I don't know, I'm going to ask you a question. What do you do when an emotion shows up? Like, how do you normally react to it or respond to it?
I run my head into the wall.
Well, that is one way of handling it.
I'm kidding, Heather. Actually, what I do is I intentionally take a very deep breath, so it gives me time to better understand what the essence of the emotion is.
So you're giving the emotion some space to breathe, in a sense.
Yes.
And that's a really skillful response. Because a lot of times we think when an emotion shows up, we need to like stop it in its tracks, or we need to run away from it or stuff it down.
Mm-hmm.
And so doing something mindful, like taking a breath and just like doing a little inquiry, what is this? And one way to kind of take that steps maybe further towards self-compassion is in this RAIN practice, where first you recognize that you're having an emotion. Sometimes we have an emotion and we've already hit our head on the wall, right? We haven't even given it space.
Mm-hmm.
So recognize you're having an emotion. Allow it to unfold is how it's usually taught, where you just give it space to kind of bubble up. I also like to think of that second step as a place where you check in. Is it safe for me to let the emotion bubble up?
Mm-hmm.
Because again, I think there are times where it's skillful to take a break and do something like the focusing meditation or look outside. So it's choice. The third part, the I, is investigate. This is where you actually turn towards, where do you feel it in your body? How big is it? What's its size, its shape, its texture? Does it have a color? Because a lot of times we really feel and experience emotions somewhere in our body, and it feels like an object. And this is totally different than ruminating about it or trying to solve it. You're just like, what is this? What am I feeling in this moment? And then the last step, the N, is nurturing. And that's where you can offer that self-compassion we were talking about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
You can say, may I have the grace to be with myself in my suffering. Or maybe you nurture yourself with a cup of tea or a breath. But it's a powerful mindfulness technique. And I think it's up there with the self-compassion practices in terms of ways that help you learn to live with whatever has happened. And I don't just mean live with as in like a resignation, but to actually continue to really live.
Yeah, thanks for explaining that. Okay, back to you. And this is the last question I'm going to ask about your personal experience for our interview today. Coming back to your evolution of integrating mindfulness into your grief journey, I'm very curious if you hit any bumps, as a metaphor, any bumps of resistance. And if, you'd be willing to share a little bit, if there's a specific story that comes to mind or something.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's a story. It's one that I've told a few times here and there. I think I might mention it briefly in the back of my Mindfulness and Grief book. So, as you know, I went to grad school for death, dying, and bereavement. And I thought I was a semester away from graduating. Turned out I'd already graduated, but I didn't know it at the time. And we'll just table that. It's what grief does to you. Like, you don't even realize you've graduated, but you have. But you're so grief stricken.
Mm-hmm.
So in my last semester, what I thought was my next to last semester, my stepfather died unexpectedly. And it'll be 12 years this year. I had already been doing yoga for grief groups, which eventually turned into my mindfulness and grief groups. I'd already written a book proposal for yoga for grief. I've already presented posters at the Association of Death Education and Counseling. I'm a practicing yoga therapist. I know everything. I'm saying that sarcastically.
Mm-hmm.
And Tom dies. And did I just sit down on a lotus flower and meditate it away? No. It was awful. It was messy. There was crying. There were some bottles of wine. There were traumatic, intrusive images because I found him. Well, I didn't find him. I came in right after he collapsed. His best friend was already there.
Oh.
And I would say I didn't meditate I just feel like I'm going to confessional, even though I wasn't raised Catholic. I feel like I did not meditate for 3 months. Now, I did bring in some mindfulness here and there. Like, I remember it must have been in the first week he died, because it's heartbreaking that the dog that we shared died a week later. And I know she was in this scene, but I remember going out in his yard, and I'm trying to deal with the house because I'm the executor. He and my mom were 4 days away from being divorced. Okay. So that was a whole other layer. And I remember like noticing the sunset and just being present and feeling my love for the dog. And so there were little moments where I was present, but there were just a lot of really messy, angry, hard moments. So yeah, I've run into that. And then what happened is, somewhere in 3 months, I remembered I had some tools I could use.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, oh yeah, you have this. But I wasn't ready to sit down on my meditation cushion.
Mm-hmm.
I was still having intrusive images. So if any of you are having, visualizations of the scene, or what you imagine to be the scene, that's trauma. So I decided that if I were my own client, I would probably work with some eyes open focusing practices. And this is where my love of tennis began. My practice was, I got a really cheap racket, and some tennis balls. And I went to the local high school. They had a wall. And for hours, I would just focus on hitting a ball against the wall.
Mm-hmm.
And that was my meditation practice.
Mm.
And when my mind wandered to other things, I'd come back to that yellow ball. Totally not what you picture for meditation, but it still had the same effect. And so I always tell people, the meditation provides guidelines for training our brain and giving it what it needs. And you can get creative with it. And for me, I needed movement. I needed exercise. I needed to get out of that house because there was so much to deal with. And what was great about it is every time I hit a ball, I could be like, huh, I sounded like Venus Williams. I did not look like her. Mm-hmm. Like, I cannot play like her. And, but I could get out this anger and the sound in a way that was healthy.
Right.
And And then, my body started getting back in line. When I would see an ambulance, I wouldn't have the flashbacks I was having. And I'm not saying that everybody can, I had a short-term traumatic experience. If you're having this long-term, you definitely want to work with a professional. Then I got back to meditation. And so
Mhm.
have grace with yourself, whatever your practice is. It'll be
Heather,
there when you're ready.
what a lovely, embodied, and beautiful story. I so appreciate you sharing that. Wow, that was a surprise to me. You even tied in hitting a yellow tennis ball. How wonderful. You answered my last question before I was going to ask you it. And I was going to tie in the personal experience of yourself and then now advice to someone who is, I'm sure someone out there listening is sitting there thinking, okay, my grief hurts. And there's this thing about mindfulness that just feels like it can help. And so I was going to ask you, if somebody listening is on the verge of that inquiry, what would you say to them? You know, what would
The
be
inquiry.
the first? Yeah, if somebody were to say to you, Heather, I'm really struggling with my grief. This mindfulness seems like it could be a fit for me, but I just don't know. What would be your
Mm.
response?
So my response is going to also surprise you. Tread carefully, because there are some people who seek out a mindfulness solution and wind up in a space where they don't understand it, and it's like, no, you just need to sit down on the cushion and be present. And that's not helpful when your mind is all over the place. And so mindfulness can be incredibly powerful for many reasons with grief. I always recommend starting with the foundation of focusing meditation, which is just focusing on one thing at a time, which might be your breath. It might be counting your breath. It might be the mantra. And then gradually working your way up to mindfulness, which is expanding awareness of what's happening in the moment. With grief, we tend to, and this is normal, I'm not saying this is bad. This is like how it goes when something bad has happened. We fixate on just one thing. And mindfulness is asking you to open your awareness to everything that's going on. It's giving you space. And so be sure that you are practicing the techniques that are most supportive to you in the moment. And if you have a teacher or someone who's telling you that you need to just be okay with what's happening in the moment. And this reminds me of kind of a funny meditation story. My very first meditation retreat I went on, the teacher would say in the middle of practice, everything is already okay. For me, everything was okay that day in that moment. But I was like, what if it isn't for somebody?
Mhm.
What if somebody's sitting there and part of me probably thought that because the very first time I went on a yoga retreat, it was 3 weeks after 9/11. Nobody was okay.
Right.
And I was back in that same place with someone saying everything is already okay. So remember that mindfulness is not about pretending everything is okay. Mindfulness is about seeing the big picture and wrapping your experience in compassion.
So appreciate that response. Well said. Heather, we're going to wrap up there today. I want to thank you so much for your personal sharing. Some of the rawness, a lot of the realness, the authenticity, and everything that you've spoken about. Also want to thank you for your knowledge. You seem to know what you're talking about. And yeah, this has just been a wonderful conversation. And I really feel strongly that for you listening, there's a lot of insight here to chew on. Thank you.
Mm. Thank you so much for having me, Reed. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to reconnect with you and to share this. So go out there and be authentic in your grief and know that there are things you can do to take care of yourself. And this is one of them.
Well, after hearing our conversation, what do you think? Do you think that practicing mindfulness will help with your grief? If you're an absolute yes, I suggest you visit Heather's website, mindfulnessandgrief.com. She's got a great online group. I'm pretty sure it's called Awaken, and I've heard that many people there make friends for life. If you're still on the fence about mindfulness for grief, hey, that's okay too. There are many different ways to grieve, and what's right for you, hey, it's indeed right for you. I really want to thank you for joining me today. It's such an honor to hold space for your healing. If you found this conversation to be helpful, I have a favor to ask. Will you please share it? You can text the link to a friend, or you can email it, or you can just simply tell someone, hey, I found a great grief support podcast called Grief Refuge. And bonus points if you're tech savvy. Would you be so kind to leave a rating and review? That would be pretty awesome. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Before we say goodbye for today, please know that I'm available to provide more support should you need it. The easiest way to reach me is by visiting griefrefuge.com. Thank you. Take care. Keep honoring your grief as part of your true nature. Be kind to yourself, and talk to you soon.